Good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure to chair the Barcelona School of Economics Lecture Series, and we are fortunate to be celebrating its 47th edition already. It's great to see so many of you once again at this gathering of the academic community here at the Institut d'Estudis Catalans in Barcelona. Today we have the honor of welcoming Professor Tenreyro. Thank you for being with us and for becoming part of this initiative in which Banc Sabadell is happy to participate. I'm also pleased to share the floor with Jordi Galí, a leader in our field, who will introduce Silvana shortly. The topic of today's lecture is especially relevant given the current global situation marked by significant economic, social, and political challenges. It highlights key aspects for the future of global economic policy and addresses issues that impact the effectiveness of traditional economic models. While the dominance of the US dollar remains a fact, there is an ongoing speculation about this status that it may be at risk. Geoeconomic fragmentation, technological innovations in payment systems, central bank digital currencies, sanctions on Russia through its central bank reserves, and rising fiscal and political vulnerabilities in the United States are some of the factors that could threaten the dollar's global standing. Europe's efforts to advance towards greater strategic independence also present an opportunity for the euro to increase its global relevance. At the same time, some traditional relationships between monetary policy and exchange rates are shifting. For example, major emerging economies have managed to overcome the historic limitation of borrowing in their own currencies. In contrast to the past, recent interest rate increases by the Federal Reserve have not triggered the usual capital flight from these economies. In short, these are just a few examples that highlight the importance and scope of the subject we are discussing today. That is why it's such a privilege to have Silvana Tenreyro with us today, given her extensive and recognized expertise in monetary policy and international economics. Thank you again, Silvana, for being here, and Jordi, the floor is yours.
I'll just make a very brief introduction to Silvana. Many of you, of course, you already know her. She's a professor at the London School of Economics, and she has spent most of her career at the LSE. In fact, she joined the LSE 2 years after she graduated from Harvard, after a 2-year stint at the Boston Fed. In addition to her position at the LSE, most prominently, she was an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England for almost 7 years, until last year. She's also the director of the International Finance and Macroeconomics Program of the CEPR. She's a fellow of the Econometric Society. She has been president of the European Economic Association. And she was a visiting researcher at CRAE in 2009 and 2010, no? That's just, she came with, also with her husband, Francesco Caselli. We tried to get them to stay, but we didn't quite succeed. She has won many awards. Let me just point to 2 of them. The Birgit Grodal Award to a European-based female economist, and the Irjut Jansson Award to a European-based economist under 45. And just a note on her research. Her research spans many areas of macro, trade, development. Perhaps her work on monetary policy, recently she's done a lot of work on monetary policy, in particular some work with Michael McLee on trying to understand why the Phillips curve has flattened and how this is a consequence of monetary policy itself, of the way that monetary policy has been conducted. She has written several papers on optimal currency areas. And also she has a line of work with Giovanni Olivei on the seasonality of wage adjustments and the consequences that this has for monetary policy, the fact that most wage adjustments are concentrated in a specific period of time at the end of the year. And also she has work on trade and development. She's looked at the impact of exchange rate volatility on trade flows and shown that it has little impact, contrary to conventional wisdom. And also she's done work trying to understand why poor countries are more volatile and display larger fluctuations. And interestingly, some of her best or most cited work is more methodological in nature. It's in econometrics because she developed a new estimator with a co-author that has had plenty of applications, including some application that Silvana herself developed on the estimation of gravity equations. So I think an interesting, a clear feature of her research is the excellent mix between policy relevance, solid theoretical background, and also a careful analysis of the empirical evidence. And I think today's paper will be a good illustration of that mix. So without further delay, let me give you the floor, and thanks again for joining us today. It's a real honor.
Thank you very much to the organizers. From here. Thank you very much to the organizers and to Sabadell for having me. And thank you, Jordi, for the introduction. And thank you also to all the presenters today. It was really great to see all this fascinating research, and it was really inspiring and fascinating for me to be sitting here and listening to your interesting work. So well done to you. Today I will talk about dollar dominance and the effectiveness of monetary policy. And this is based on joint work I'm doing with Michael McLeod from the Bank of England. The usual disclaimers apply. So my question will be very narrow, so let me warn you. There are many dimensions of dollar dominance that are very, very important. Here, the question we're tackling is a very specific one. Can monetary policy help stabilize the economy in a world of dollar dominance? That is, in a world in which the US dollar is the main currency of invoice in international trade transactions. And let me give you a background for the question. As we learned from the work of Linda Goldberg and Cedric Thiel, as well as Gita Gopinath, the US dollar is the main currency of invoicing in international trade transactions. Even though trade with the United States is less than 10% of global trade, more than 50% of international trade transactions are invoiced in US dollars. Now, this dollar dominance has led to a new paradigm, the dominant currency pricing paradigm, that is shifting policy views. In particular, so actually maybe before I go to that, you can see the plot here illustrating the dollar dominance. So here you can see, for example, Spain, less than 5% of total exports of Spain are to the United States. However, over 30% of the international trade transactions by Spain are invoiced in dollars. So these bars, so in light blue, you see the share of exports relative to total trade, share of exports with the United States. And in dark blue, you see exports invoiced in dollars as a share of total exports. Okay, so for countries like Argentina and Brazil, more than 90% of their exports are invoiced in dollars, even though trade with the United States is less than 20%. So going back to what I was saying, this dollar dominance has been shifting policy views significantly. The key inference that has been drawn from the use of the dollar is that it makes the prices of exports and the demand for exports less responsive to exchange rates. And as such, this reduces the value of exchange rates as automatic stabilizers. And this limits the benefits from having an independent monetary policy, which is part of the discussion now in some countries like Argentina, for example, if it were to follow the road of dollarization, how much it will lose from that. So according to this view of the world, well, not much, because monetary policy is not that, that effective after all with dollar dominance. So this is a bit I got from the IMF global report in 2019. The view that is shaping up is that exchange rates may need to be supported by other stabilization tools, perhaps capital controls, because as such, they don't help stabilize economies. There is very little response from exports to exchange rates. In the jargon of this literature, there's little expenditure switching in response to exchange rate depreciations or appreciations. Now, why is this? There are two assumptions made in the dominant currency literature. The first one is that exporters have monopoly power. And the second, and most critically, is that prices are sticky. And in this literature, they're sticky in US dollars. Now, the point that we want to make in this paper is that the prevalence of the dollars is quite striking in sectors that tend to sell homogeneous goods or goods and services that operate under highly competitive settings. And indeed, many developing and emerging market producers are price takers or near price takers in these markets. They tend to export commodities or commodity-like products with limited market power. And even when there is some market power, these prices tend to be flexible. And the extreme example is commodities, which are quoted always in US dollars, but their prices tend to be very flexible. And I should say that even in advanced economies, producers often face very elastic demands in global markets. And that's the case, for example, for the United Kingdom, for example. So let me guide you through the logic of the dominant currency literature and why it leads to those policy implications that monetary policy is not effective and it calls for other stabilization tools. Okay, so here we have the picture of an exporter who is a monopolist and faces a downward sloping demand curve. And we have our marginal cost. Let's assume for now that the exporter sets the optimal price, and we will assume that this price is sticky, and is sticky in US dollars, okay? Now, let's consider what happens when there is a depreciation of the local currency. The peso depreciates. So in this setting, let's suppose that there's some wage rigidity or some rigidity in the prices of non-tradable inputs. In that case, the cost of inputs expressed in dollars will tend to fall with a depreciation. So what happens to this monopolist? The price in dollar doesn't change. The costs are falling, but the price doesn't change. The quantities demanded in the export market don't change, and that's it. Exports don't move. And also in these models, there's no entry, so you don't have an entry margin. Potentially, you could think that other exporters could enter the market, take advantage of this extra profitability, but that doesn't happen in this type of models. So, and this is where all the sort of policy inference is coming from. Now let's think about the opposite example, or the other extreme, in which the producer is a price taker in international markets. And let's consider what happens if there is a depreciation of the peso. Again, the cost curve will fall. Inputs are becoming relatively cheaper when expressed in dollars. In this case, the price also doesn't change, but not because there is a pricing friction. There's no nominal friction here. It's just because the producer is facing a perfectly elastic demand. It's a price taker. But the quantities change. Okay, so there is a movement in quantities demanded here. There is expenditure switching towards this product, and this leads to a very different implication for policy if taken at face value. So I think one of the problems or one of the issues with the literature is that it has interpreted the lack of pass-through from exchange rate depreciations into export prices as evidence of price rigidity in export markets, rather than contemplating the possibility that in equilibrium prices are not changing because the demands are elastic or cost curves are increasing. And so that has basically shaped the analysis and the models that people use to explain this feature. So somewhere in between is the case of producers who sell goods and services with highly elastic demands and flexible prices. So in this case, again, we have a depreciation. Prices change very little, not because there is a nominal rigidity, simply because these demands are very elastic and we have an upward sloping cost curve. So if we increase quantities, the marginal cost will be higher. So in this setting, again, we see very little response in prices, but a big expansion in quantities. And so exchange rate depreciations can have a stabilization or the effect of boosting exports, as in the standard canonical Mandel-Fleming model, or the ideas that Milton Friedman had in mind when he was thinking about the expenditure switching power of exchange rates. So just to pause here, the message here is that with monopolists and sticky prices in dollars, and exchange rate depreciation does not affect the prices of exports in dollars and the quantities demanded. And monetary policy has a very small effect. In contrast with commodity or commodity-like producers and flexible prices, and exchange rate depreciation again doesn't change the price of exports much when expressed in dollars, but it can lead to a large increase in export quantities. And in this case, monetary policy can have a large effect. The constraint here is not on demand, it's on supply capacity. Please feel free to ask questions. So just bottom line, we've made a lot of progress in understanding that the dollar is used in international trade transactions, but the fact that trade is invoiced in dollars doesn't mean that those prices are rigid necessarily in dollars. In fact, what we learn from the evidence is that the more competitive the market, the more likely it is that producers will use a dollar or some other vehicle currency in pricing. And as I said, this small change in assumptions here can have consequential implications for the role of monetary policy and its effectiveness, and what we are telling countries to do with their policies and instruments. So let me discuss a little bit the empirics here. The first observation I wanted to share is that homogeneous products, as classified by Rausch, those sold in organized markets or those that are based on reference prices, tend to be a large share of exports for emerging and developing economies. So for developing economies, they are over 70% of their trade is in homogeneous goods. For emerging economies, that number is 60%. For advanced economies, on average, that share is about 35%. Spain is here on the lower end. There are some advanced economies that have a large share, like Norway, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And similarly, there are also outliers. Chile, Ghana tend to export a much larger share of homogeneous goods than the average developing or emerging economy. The second observation, I mean, I don't have any data, but I'm sure you will believe me, is that commodity prices are very flexible. They change by the second. I mean, they are changing at high frequency. There is some evidence that I can cite here, papers like Bills and Clino, Nakamura and Steinson, that they look at some of the disaggregated data. Even early work by Gopinath and Rigobon find that the duration of differentiated goods prices tend to be 5 to 10 times higher than those of homogeneous goods. But for anyone who's following commodity markets and the frequency of adjustment is super high. The third factor or observation is that I mentioned before is that invoicing in dollars or vehicle currencies tend to be more prevalent for homogeneous competitive goods sectors. And that's the intuition that McKinnon had back in the 70s. That then was formalized by Baketa and Van Winkop. The idea is that producers with low market power in homogeneous good markets will tend to price in foreign currencies to keep very competitive and keep track of their competitors in global markets. Goldberg and Thiel also have some evidence from Canadian imports showing that those firms exporting to Canada tend to price in dollars when they're selling homogeneous goods and have low market shares. This chart here shows a correlation between the share of homogeneous goods in exports and the share of exports invoiced in dollars using the cross-sectional evidence since 1985. So we see here a very tight connection. For every 10 percentage point increase in the share of homogeneous goods in exports, we see a nearly 8 percentage point increase in dollar invoicing in exports. So that's most of what I have to say for today. What I would do now is guide you through the model that we put together, which is pretty much a standard model in the literature, except that we allow for flexible prices in export markets in the case of homogeneous goods. And then I'll show you some further empirical evidence. Okay, so the model we use here is the standard New Keynesian setting. We focus on a small open economy, and we assume that financial markets are incomplete. This is not strictly necessary, so we deviate a little bit from Jordi and Monacelli's canonical model in international finance. My way to think about Jordi's model, the Galli-Monacelli as we know it, is that it's more geared towards developed economies in which exports tend to be more differentiated, so producer currency pricing tends to be more appropriate. And this would be more like the version of that model, but applied to developing or emerging markets where producers tend to have little market power. So in terms of production and competition, we have imported intermediates in production. This is important for quantitative purposes because we don't want to overdo the effect or the size of the effect that we are emphasizing here. So we will calibrate it in a reasonable way, in a realistic way. The model we have, again, is slightly different from Monticelli, Galli-Monticelli, in that it allows for a more flexible market structure that allows for more intra-sectoral international competition and heterogeneity in price stickiness. So in particular, the model will have low substitutability across different goods and services, but more competition within a sector or good across varieties. And that competition can happen across producers, local producers, and between local and international producers. So we will alter the standard way in which the international finance literature tends to aggregate or nest the production function. The typical, for those related with who know that literature, typically we think about consumption of different goods produced in different countries, and within those composite goods, there is differentiation of varieties within that sector or good. Here, basically the outer layer would be sectors or goods, and within that, there will be competition across variety, both domestically and abroad. Then for wage and price setting, we will assume sticky prices following Calvo's setup, and the setting will nest producer currency pricing, which is, again, the Galli-Monticelli and the canonical Mandel-Fleming, and we will have dollar pricing combined with flexible prices. Once you have flexible prices, really the invoicing currency becomes irrelevant. Okay, so the economy here is a small open economy, as I said, and we take the dynamics of the rest of the world as given. So this is our representative household here. It maximizes lifetime utility, and that utility depends on consumption and labor effort. And this is what I was explaining before. Consumption here is an aggregate of different goods or sectors, G. And within each sector G, there are different varieties that can be produced locally or imported from abroad. Okay? So this is more the type of structure used in international trade than in international finance. The budget constraint will be standard here. The household can use its labor income, rebates from profits, and any new issue debt, either international or domestic, to fund consumption and the repayment of interest and other debt. Okay, so here the assumption, as I said, is that there is perfect risk sharing domestically, but there's only a risk-free bond internationally, so there's imperfect risk sharing internationally. And then this structure leads to a standard uncovered interest parity condition, which will link exchange rate to domestic monetary policy. When there is a monetary policy tightening, we will see an appreciation of the currency. Production here is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate of labor inputs and domestic inputs that, again, can be produced domestically or abroad. And we assume that, or we allow for decreasing returns to scale at the industry level. We made the assumption that intermediate inputs are aggregated in the same way as consumption goods in the utility function, so that allows for a simple aggregation of demands at the variety level. So labor markets, we assume that labor is a composite of different workers that belong to different unions, and that's the differentiation here. So our union members are indexed by age, and we have a standard demand and wage setting at the union level following a Calvo framework. So in what I will show you now, we will be comparing the implications from flexible prices with Calvo sticky prices, either under the dominant currency setting or the producer currency pricing setting. So let me just say the last bit on the model. We close it by assuming that monetary policy follows a Taylor rule with some smoothing here, and this is the shock that we're giving to the model, a monetary policy shock view. And all markets clear, and let me now turn to the simulations. Let me just skip the details of the calibration. It's very standard. It follows a literature on most. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. First, again, in the flexible price specification, we allow for homogeneous goods to have a high elasticity of substitution, which we take from the work of Broad and Weinstein. And for the rest, we use, and we assume that those goods are flexible. The prices of those goods are flexible. For the rest, we assume wage and price rigidity. The implicit assumption here is that these wages and non-tradable goods prices are adjusting on average once a year. And again, we don't know exactly what the degree of decreasing returns to scale are in these commodity markets or homogeneous goods markets. So we play with different specifications. By the way, I keep saying commodities, but here we really have a monopolistic competition structure. So we allow for non-perfectly elastic demands. It's just that it's a very high elasticity demand. And the framework is very flexible and allows us to play with these numbers and actually do a lot more than what we're doing here, which, as you will see, is just trying to explain what I show you in the early figures. So this is the headline graph in the paper. So this shows, these lines here show the impulse responses to a monetary policy shock by the domestic monetary policy authority. And this shows the responses and their different specifications or calibrations of the model. So let me start with the producer currency pricing, which is, again, the canonical Mandel-Fleming and the one behind the intuition, early intuition on expenditure switching coming from exchange rate fluctuations. So in this case, when there is a depreciation, the export price mechanically falls. Okay, and this is, again, the case for flexible exchange rates that Milton Friedman had in mind, and that leads to expenditure switching and increasing export volumes for that product, okay, or for that country's exports. The blue line shows the dominant currency pricing specification. And in here, by assumption, there's no change in prices in dollars. And because demands are because of the assumption on the elasticities of demand, this leads to virtually no change in export volumes in this case. Okay? And then finally, we have our preferred calibration here. In this case, export prices in dollars don't change at all. So this is the same result in the dominant currency literature and in some of the preliminary or preliminary work done on pass-through. But in contrast to the result on export volumes, we have a big response on export volumes. Okay, so we can restore the price properties of the dominant currency literature, but allowing for the quantity responses in the producer currency literature. Yeah. This is because demand is elastic and the prices are flexible. Yeah, and obviously implicit here is also there are also assumptions on the supply side that allows for an expansion. The more you constrain that, the less of a response you will get. And, okay, so I mean these are the responses for other variables. Output tends to mimic the responses of export prices. Export volume. And not much more to report. Here is the averages when we look at the quantitative effects of these. So these are the three specifications. So this is the Mandel-Fleming. There is sticky pricing in the local currency. This one is sticky pricing in dollars, the dominant currency paradigm, and this is our preferred specification. So in all cases, with the monetary policy shock leads to a depreciation of the exchange rate. In the case of local currency, producer currency pricing, we have a response in export prices that is material and a consequent increase in quantities exported and produced. Here we see the case of dollar pricing. There is virtually no change in export prices here and very little change in export volumes. And finally, this is the other case in which we get a large effect on quantities comparable to the effect on producer currency pricing, while still not getting any change in prices, in export prices. And going back to Alberto's question, that's part of the story is it's a combination of two things: elastic demands and flexible prices. So prices change very little here, and there is an expansion in activity or exports. And what matters here, I mean, basically under flexible pricing, there's the effect of the depreciation, but also the effect of moving along the marginal cost curve, because you increase production and so you move up in the marginal cost curve, and that will determine how much prices change in equilibrium. Under dollar pricing, there's no change because the price is fixed in dollars. Under producer currency pricing, the change in prices is exactly the same as the change in the exchange rate. In exchange rate change, and here it's a combination of the exchange rate depreciation and the marginal cost curve. And the quantity effect will be just the elasticity of demand times these changes in prices. Okay, so in the paper we do some other exercises for those who are interested. We look at different degrees of decreasing returns to scale in production. And then we play a bit with the calibration in terms of allowing more of a combination of producer currency pricing firms and dollar pricing firms. I mean, it turns out that if you allow for this fact that when you price in dollars, you tend to be homogeneous, high elasticity, and combined with the fact that those pricing in the producer currency tend to sell differentiated goods. When you merge them together, you get the same effects on quantities and the same intuition of Mandel-Fleming and Friedman. Yes. you still need some underlying rigidity or nominal friction, which in this case is coming from the non-tradables or the wages. You still need an effect. I mean, you need the nominal friction for monetary policy to have an effect. Yeah. Yes.
In the intermediate goods are priced at the local currency. Intermediate goods.
So we have. So depending on the specification, when we do dollar pricing, we price them in dollars, and we mimic the assumption. I mean, that's the dominant currency paradigm. And when we do producer currency pricing, we price them at the producer prices.
And the proportion of those, like you used to tell us that the proportion.
So that should be relevant. I mean, we use a calibration from the literature, but bearing that should matter. In fact, I mean, the more dollar pricing there is in the imported goods, obviously the more costly imported goods will become with the depreciation, so that will affect the trade balance and so on and so forth. So that's another important margin. For now, we just take the calibration in the literature and play with that. But going back to Vladimir's question and combining it with you, to get an effect, what's important is that in the cost base of these producers, there's some part of it that is rigid in the producer currency. That's what gives the monetary policy its effectiveness. And so you could have some imported inputs into production, which will tend to lower the effectiveness of monetary policy or lower the expansionary effects of the depreciation. But as long as you have non-tradable or sticky wages, you will get an effect. And then the discussion is quantitative, and it will vary across countries, and there's a lot more to do there. Okay, I think I just made clear the distinction between the and now it's a 2023, I think, AER paper and the calibration in our model. So the key difference is that we have low market power and high elasticities of demand, whereas in the calibrations in the literature, there's high market power and inelastic demands. The difference is that export prices in one case are sticky, in our case are flexible. Both cases lead to very low pass-through or limited pass-through from exchange rate changes into export prices, but they lead to very different implications for quantities. So just to highlight that pass-through into prices cannot help distinguish the two models, and just observing lack of pass-through is not telling us whether the price sticky, there is a nominal rigidity, or simply there is just high elasticities of demand, and the producers are price takers or near price takers. So the next exercise we do is to use identified monetary policy shocks to look at the effect on export volumes and activities. And so basically replicate what we do in the model in the data, or try to do the same exercise. Now, before, let me just tell you, some other people have done this type of exercises before. For some economies, there's not a lot outside the US and Europe. But there is a paper by Champagne and Seckel for Canada, and what they find is that tightening monetary policy tends to lead to falls, to an appreciation of the exchange rate, and falls in exports and overall activity. For the developed countries, for the UK, we have the same patterns. Tightenings lead to exchange rate appreciations and falls in exports. An increase here is an exchange rate appreciation. Our sort of conjecture is that in most developed countries, this is mostly driven by the old intuition of producer currency pricing and differentiated goods. given that the share of homogeneous goods tends to be smaller. Now, what we learn from large devaluations, and this is a tricky exercise because obviously depreciations or devaluations happen for a reason. What we learn is that after large devaluations, and here I have a few examples, Argentina in 2001, Brazil after the Russian crisis, and Mexico in the tequila, that tends to lead to big expansions in exports relative to trend or relative to global exports. As I said, depreciations don't happen in a vacuum. They are fully endogenous. But to the extent that this depreciation or devaluations tend to happen when the economy is very weak and exports are weak, the fact that we see these big increases in exports actually is quite telling. So that's some sort of hint in the direction of the point we're making in this paper. We go a little bit more therein, and I say more therein because it's already pretty brave to run bars for some advanced economies, given that there are changes in institutional setups, tools, and it's hard to identify monetary policy shocks. It's even more the case for developing and emerging economies. But again, we took that step. We used a database that Brandao Marquez and co-authors put together. They produce a series of monetary policy shocks, which they identify as residuals from a Taylor type rule, which uses forecast inflation, forecast output gaps, and exchange rates, and they extract from that what they call the monetary policy shock. And we feed this monetary policy shock into our local projection exercises. And again, there's a lot of assumptions here, and there's a lot of noise, but this is what you would get if you did that assumption. Again, this is done for for a panel of 38 emerging and developing countries. So what we have here is that, again, very similar to what we see for Canada and the UK, for these countries as well, a tightening of monetary policy leads to an exchange rate appreciation and a fall in exports and industrial production, which is the data we have here. So it's very similar, and we don't find this evidence that exports are unresponsive or activity is unresponsive. So just to conclude and leave some time for discussion, this literature, the dominant currency literature, has highlighted the importance of the dollar in international trade transactions and in the finance world, and this is an important question to issue to study. However, the policy conclusions are based on two assumptions that are not backed up by the data. And this is that, and again, the fact that the assumption that prices are sticky in dollars and there's monopoly power. What we find or argue in this paper is that the dollar is more likely to be used in highly competitive markets where prices tend to be flexible. So in the paper, we try to work with a more general framework that allows for greater global competition and price flexibility in some goods or sectors, while having monopoly power and rigidity in others. And the model is very flexible and can potentially be calibrated more precisely for different countries with better micro evidence to parameterize it. And as I said, I mean, we get very little pass-through of exchange rates into prices, but we don't think that's evidence of a nominal price rigidity, quite the opposite in this type of settings. And we find that the evidence from large devaluations, 3 case studies that we have, is consistent with this specification of the model, as is the evidence coming from identified monetary policy shocks. So we think that perhaps it's time to revisit the policy advice, especially because most of the clients of the IMF, for example, tend to be emerging and developing economies with a high share of homogeneous goods. So I'll pause here and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvana. As always, very clear, very simple, and so that it helps a lot in the debate. In terms, let me just throw a suggestion. You're looking at export sectors or tradable sectors where the price is in dollars and the domestic inputs are at least in part in domestic currency. Let's think about non-tradable sectors, where you're going to see the opposite. Perhaps they have inputs in dollars and the domestic prices are not quoted in dollars, are quoted in domestic currency. Perhaps one way to assess the effect on quantities is to see whether there is a big reallocation from tradables to non-tradables when you have such a devaluation. So that if the economy, the share of tradables and non-tradables remains very similar, perhaps there has been little effect on quantities. But perhaps what you would observe is that the tradable sectors expand a lot when you have this depreciation, but the non-tradables contract, and that would give you some hint about the quantities. Is this a correct view, or am I missing something, or have you considered?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and it has to be combined with the capacity constraints in these industries. I mean, I haven't thought about this, but I think you are right that we should see somewhere some reallocation.
Labor can move. Or
exactly. Yeah, I mean, we do know that in large devaluations from the work of Ariel Bersens, etc., the non-tradable prices plays a big role because those are sticky in the local currency. So that mechanism is here, but it would be great to look at the data and look at the reallocation between non-tradables and tradables. One thing that is mildly related, I don't know if is what happened during Brexit. Because when the depreciation of sterling after the referendum was not an exogenous event. I mean, markets were pricing the fact that in the future, perhaps productivity in the tradable sector will grow more slowly or will be lower than otherwise. But the depreciation actually caused a big reallocation or a big expansion in the tradable sector. At the time, it was all puzzling. I mean, we thought, or we were saying, economists were saying that Brexit will be very bad for the tradable sector. But after the referendum, the depreciation happened, the productivity was not changed, the trade barriers didn't happen, so all the effect there was just exchange rate. And we saw this expansion, and that was a sweet spot for exporters after the referendum. So it goes in that direction. And in the paper I have with Ben Broadbent and others, we see some of these sectoral effects. We haven't done it for these countries, and I suspect for some it could be feasible to get the data, but it's something that we might think we probably could do, at least for some of these countries to test the mechanism.
And in cases like the three countries that you had more homogeneous in terms of exports, like the copper in Chile, the cocoa in Ghana, or petroleum in other countries, those have a very low cost compared with value added because you are taking natural resources that are not included in the equation. No, there are some natural resources here that you could just
Can pump out.
Pump out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question of constraint. I think you have to go sector by sector, because there will be a difference in, scaling up. I mean, this is Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and it might be different, for some countries. In Argentina, I think there's a lot of, what do you call sorry, I have my brain fogs. So the extensive market is very important. We don't have it in here, but I think it's, this can be as a shortcut for that. When there is a big depreciation, a lot of producers that were not competitive before selling, leather products can enter that market. And this is, in some sense, what can push exports as well. But for other countries, for Mexico, it might be oil. And I think it's important to get into the specifics of these economies and try to understand, what are those capacity constraints, and which we haven't done it, and I think it would be interesting. What is remarkable is that, again, we see very similar responses between advanced and emerging developing economies. So it cannot be that the invoicing in dollars is preventing, this adjustment. But the quantities might differ, and I guess it relates a bit to what Jama was saying, because in some cases it might be easier to reallocate labor or inputs from one sector to the other. In some others it might be different. So maybe that's also something to explore, that diversity here or heterogeneity.
I'll ask a question about, because in the model you were looking at monetary policy-induced devaluation.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking whether under DCP you would actually not get a contraction in exports. And because when you devalue, there's domestic boom, but export prices don't change, so you should reallocate inputs towards domestic, non-tradables or domestic production, right? And I think empirically, I don't think you will ever find. So let's say you have a monetary expansion. There's a domestic boom at the same time when there's depreciation of the currency. Mm-hmm. Exports don't change if you control for the cost.
Yeah,
but now there's a desire there's a crowding out of the exports due to domestic pressure on inputs. Let's say if it's labor, as an example, it should reallocate to non-tradables, if I'm not mistaken here. But it seems like empirically you will never probably detect a case where monetary expansion leads to a contraction of exports. I don't know.
So, I have to think about it. I guess even in the dominant currency setting, there will be an effect on monetary policy through financial markets that will boost the economy through that. It's not going to happen through the export market, but through the financial market, and you will see that. And so in that regard, you should see, an expansion in the domestic sector. So in the that it makes sense. What I think the way they calibrate it and why they don't get a negative and rather a zero, but we're talking about specific calibration, is that they still have some calvo settings. So some producers are adjusting in their calibration when. So there is sticky prices in dollars, but there will be some producers that get touched by the magic wand. But yeah, you're right that otherwise, if they were fully stuck with the prices, all of them, then we should see that movement. Yeah. And David has.
Yeah, well, thanks again for this very inspiring talk. I just wanted to hear your view about how we could interpret these results for policymakers. So the countries that you have mentioned typically have engaged in some form of control, some exchange rate agreements and so on. However, what you are suggesting here is that since prices are flexible in the foreign currency, maybe it's not so crucial to stabilize the exchange rate. Is this something we should learn from your analysis or not? So
all we're saying, I don't want to exaggerate the message. We're saying is that exchange rate can act as automatic stabilizers, and And that's very different than the policy conclusion drawn from the dominant currency paradigm that they cannot, okay? So then you might say, well, a country may still need to put capital controls for other reasons that are not in this paper, and, you know, totally fine with that, but, you know, it's not coming from this mechanism that has been emphasized in the literature. And if we want to discuss capital controls, we need to present the mechanism and then quantify it and then try to gauge how much is needed. But it's not, you know, coming from that. You are right that in practice, countries have manipulated, or, you know, and I come from a country that, how many exchange rates do we have in Argentina? I mean, a lot. So there's a lot of controls and a lot of intervention by the central banks, and there are different exchange rates for different. I mean, that's obviously an extreme and perhaps not the one to follow. But and there have been more successful cases of exchange rate intervention, and there's more need to study. All the message here is that however you think about the problem is not coming from this friction, and if you want to quantify how much you want to put in terms of macro proofs or capital controls, you need a model that will help you think about it and put numbers on it.
Thanks. So I just wanted to ask about like the quantitative takeaways from what you showed us, that basically you, if I understood correctly, you presented us these three paradigms of the theoretical model. They had different qualitative predictions for how exports should respond, and then you showed us empirical evidence on exports responding and qualitatively agreeing with one of the paradigms more than the others. Have you also like thought about the magnitudes, that maybe if reality is actually a mix of these three, like a convex combination of these three different paradigms, that could you maybe invert the exercise and do like impulse response matching and say how close we are actually to each of these paradigms? Is that something doable?
I mean, I think when we try to do some quantitative exercises in the model, no, and go, but then the question is, you know, if you're and this, the result we get is that when we combine producer currency pricing plus differentiated goods and dollar pricing and homogeneous goods, you get the same result as if they were all the traditional model under Fleming, or, you know, the flexible calibration that we have. So what you suggest is like, okay, let's have a third category in which the dollar pricing is actually sticky in dollars, and, you know, we can do that as well. And
I more meant like potentially that the model is actually like a flexible version that nests all of the paradigms, where the distance from the different paradigms is a parameter, and that you could, you know, quantify that parameter with the size of the impulse responses of exports, for example.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to think more about that. Yeah. So just when I compare Canada and the emerging and developing countries, it looks very similar in terms of, you know, magnitudes as well. And that's what we get from the model. So if we were to, you know, introduce this other category, I think it won't match as well. But with better data, one could actually try to pin down better these parameters. And perhaps there are, you know, some countries out there that use dollar pricing for differentiated goods and they're sticky. My intuition would be, you know, based on the fact that exporters or firms typically like depreciations, I mean, those in the export market, the fact that they like it so much is that there is, you know, there is a gain there, and, you know, either you get it through the intrinsic market or firms, you know, being able now to sell in bigger or in a wider range of markets when there is a depreciation. But yeah, I mean, we haven't explored it much, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Silvana. I just had a very simple question for those of us that are not really in this literature. So imagine you started by telling us, look, if I have this pricing in dollars, devaluations may not be effective, no? Essentially. Now you show us, look, there's a bunch of countries, if my demand is elastic, even if I price in dollars, well, we're going to get back the conventional result. But then you also show us the case of the UK, where you also seem to get the conventional result. There, I think you said that, well, there the dollar pricing may not be as relevant. It's domestic currency pricing, presumably because the UK is a
currency, yeah.
producer, because the UK is a large economy. So for which type of countries would this paradigm apply, the paradigm that you're trying to debunk, in a sense?
Yeah, I would not call it paradigm, just a calibration.
No.
Yeah.
But I'm saying
Yeah.
this basic notion that you're saying, well, there's this
Yeah.
predominant view that
Yeah.
the dollar pricing would suggest that devaluations are not that effective as an automatic stabilizer. But here you're showing us in emerging markets, it seems to be countries like the UK, it seems to go in the right direction. So in which type of countries?
Okay. So what we see here is that exchange rate depreciations tend to increase exports, where we're talking about the UK, which sells more differentiated products, hugely, but and versus emerging and developing economies. My sense is that the Mandel-Fleming setup with differentiated goods and producer currency pricing applies more to countries like the United States or more developed economies. Obviously not Canada or Australia that sell more homogeneous goods, but yeah, countries that tend to sell differentiated goods. And in those countries, you're back to Milton Friedman, a depreciation leads to expenditure switching. Yeah? For emerging and developing countries, you have more dollar pricing, but as I said, that tends to apply to products that are homogeneous and with flexible prices, and again, you get the same response for exports. Just in terms of dollar pricing, the prices don't move, but you get the boost coming from monetary policy. So yeah, answering your question, we should see more Mandel-Fleming producer currency pricing in developed economies selling differentiated goods, and dollar pricing, but with more flexibility in emerging developing economies.
I agree, but the policy lesson seems to be that in both of these countries,
exchange rate are automatic stabilizers. Yeah. In both, in all countries, that would be our conclusion. So we're basically just sort of arguing against the recent conclusions from this literature that said, no, they are not. Actually, we think they are, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I had a question. I think it's kind of related to what we were saying. But homogeneous goods, there includes commodities and I'm guessing other homogeneous goods. And with commodities especially, I'm guessing, yes, developing countries are price takers, but those would be highly concentrated markets as well. And I'm wondering whether that would have an impact on how monetary policy, or the depreciation feeds through the rest of the economy. If we have very high markups in the commodity.
So you're thinking, so they are competitive in global markets, these producers of, say, some commodities, but then they command some monopsony power within, vis-a-vis the inputs. That's possible. And so then your question is very important, how much a depreciation which will benefit the commodity producers will percolate to the rest of the economy, and there are issues of distribution, and so yeah, I cannot say anything about that. It will depend on the country pretty much, and the structure of taxes and transfers in that country, how redistributive the system is. In some, Norway, will redistribute a lot more than some Latin American countries, and they have their sovereign wealth fund where they're putting some of this money as well. That's not a good example, actually. But yeah, so I think, yeah, you need to, it will be a case by case how much this goes to the rest of the economy, and monopsony power will be important, and tax structure in the economy. yeah, I don't have much to say, but it's obviously an important question. And so ours, what we're saying is mostly at the macro level, you know, about the power of these exchange rates as automatic stabilizers, but it's a very aggregate level, and don't have much to say about the trickle down.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have just a very short question on, you showed, you know, the ratio of dollar invoices, and started your talk with the weight of dollar invoices compared to well, you know, worldwide. And I was wondering about the trends. Do you know anything about whether this is increasing or decreasing over time? The share of dollar invoices, is this dominance changing over time? Is it?
Yeah, okay, I don't know much. I think people have been studying that. There's now a literature on vehicle currency. I'm not sure we have long-time series on these shares. There's a paper by Emin Bo and co-authors where they do have some, the data is a little bit patchy, but I mean, so in the regressions that I showed you, most of the identification is coming from the cross-section, you know, across countries, because it's a bit patchy for when they, and we use their data for when they can measure. I'm only familiar with, you know, with recent work on vehicle currency, and I think, for example, there has been an increase in the use of the euro, for example, and but yeah, I should know this, but yeah, I don't know what the trends are. So it's something to look at. Yeah, as I said, in our database, because the time series is so patchy, we just use the cross-sectional. But yeah.
I think it's about time, right? We made so many questions that you're probably thinking, well, well, it looks like your conference was so interesting, and it brought a lot of questions and thinking. So that means that we really want to thank you, Silvana, for being with us and giving such a great talk. And thank you, everybody, for attending the Trobada and the conference, the BSE lecture that was, as usual, sponsored by Banc Sabadell. And Sophia said it was the 47th this year. Okay, so good counting. So thank you, everybody. And we'll keep doing many things during the year.